Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and this week my guest is Chris McDonald, MP for Stockton North and Minister for Industry. A brief which, of course, includes construction. Lots to discuss, not least since we've just passed the first anniversary of the creation of NISTA, the UK's National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority. This was set up to accelerate delivery and unlock private investment, but also to improve project efficiency. And last June, it was handed responsibility for delivering the government's ambitious 10-year infrastructure strategy, shifting policy vision into a £718 billion public and private sector delivery reality. So lots of opportunity for the construction sector, but the challenges are mounting. Persistent skills gap, volatile supply chains, stringent new building safety regulations, and inflation pushing up costs, and an accelerating challenge of meeting net zero goals. Chris is the latest in a long line of construction ministers charged with supporting the industry to deliver this ambition. And as a Minister for the Industry, his responsibilities go wider as he helps to deliver the industrial strategy, overseeing a portfolio that bridges the gap between raw industrial capacity and national renewal. So lots to talk about. Let's crack on. Chris, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks, Anthony. It's lovely to be here. I mean, you're right. I am the latest in a very long line of ministers, and hopefully I'll be around for a little while longer yet. But I might well be the only construction minister who's actually worked in the construction industry. But, you know, we can have a little bit more of a chat about that at some point, if you like.
Let's start with the strategy for delivery. Construction remains a key driver for economic growth. And with NISTA now well and truly up and running, we've got this 10-year strategy and a dynamic pipeline. What evidence is there that we're generally moving from planning and strategy to actually delivering construction projects, you know, with spades in the ground, as they say?
Well, look, if we just looked at the sort of the headline in terms of figures, the part of the construction sector that concerns me the most is house building.
Right.
And that's partly because, you know, we've got a target to build 1.5 million homes by the end of the Parliament, and because, you know, we need to make sure that people in places like Stockton North, where I am, where there's an acute shortage of housing, do have homes. But if I think about my role as industry minister and my construction brief, we know that it's house building that really just drives the whole construction market along. Yeah. And what we've seen in the last year is we've seen an uptick in starts and completions compared with the previous year, but it's still not where it was in 2019.
Yeah.
So there is still a lot more to do. And I think the strategy that we've had as a government has covered a couple of areas, really. So one is really about providing some level of certainty. And I mentioned the home building target. That certainly helps with that.
Which is 1.5 million homes.
1.5 million homes by the end of the Parliament. So that, but also our infrastructure pipeline, that gives certainty as well, because it's a pipeline that extends over a decade. So I think that certainty bit is really quite important. But then the other thing is really just trying to identify the barriers that get in the way of people doing this as well, and that's where our Planning Act comes in.
Well, I would talk about all this. It's interesting that you highlight housing, because, as you say, we've got this, you know, this 1.5 million new homes to be built in this Parliament. Mike Reeder MP, when I spoke to him recently, he reckoned he was going to be the last person hanging on to that target. But of course, it's not technically part of your brief. Because housing is, you know, it's out of the MCHLG.
Yes.
I mean, is it a target that you still feel is deliverable then?
So you're right. It's not part of my brief. It's, as you say, Minister of Housing, Communities and Local Government. But the relevant minister there, Matthew Pennycook, he and I are working very closely both on this for housing and also for infrastructure as well. So it's actually Matthew's target. So I think you need to ask him about the deliverability of the target. My job is to make sure that we get the construction sector in the right place to be able to deliver it. And I'm concerned about that, because, as I said, it's really housing that drives the whole construction industry. When you look at, we've got a lot of issues on the material side as well, around where we've got spare productive capacity in cement, in plasterboard, in brick production in the UK, in glass as well. Those industries are relying on that demand signal from house building. Yeah. And so getting the demand signal in place has been a good thing. Dealing with the planning and infrastructure, which took quite a long time at the start of the Parliament, but that's dealt with now as well. And so that's why I think we're seeing these housing starts are really starting to tick up.
Because your background before becoming an MP, of course, is in the steel industry, working first for Tata Steel and then leading the Material Processing Institute for 10 years. I mean, high inflation across the material sector, it remains a problem. And you know, it's a major problem for the construction sector. Do you see a solution to this inflation problem?
So, well, I think inflation is, there are bits of inflation that you can deal with and bits that you can't. I mean, let's just be honest about that. And the bits that we can't deal with are those parts of inflation that are arising as a result of the disruption in the Middle East. And it seems to me, and I'm sure it must seem to your listeners and to people in the construction industry, that if it wasn't me sitting here, it would be a previous minister saying, oh, well, yes, but there's inflation as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And before that, it was COVID, which really sent prices through the roof. I mean, tell me about it. I had a project at home I was trying to complete. And the problem is, I think we have to recognise we are in a very sort of unstable situation in terms of global supply chains. And so what I'm interested in as the industry minister is where can we look closer to home for some of these materials. So you'll have seen, and I'm sure your listeners are aware that we've taken some really serious action on steel to try and increase our domestic steel production from 30% of the UK market to 50%. And obviously about half of that is construction steels. And as I mentioned, we've got a lot of spare capacity on cement as well. And so we're addressing, from a UK perspective, we're addressing the fundamental costs of doing business for those materials-based industries that are in the UK, so that we can win additional private sector investment into those areas and increase their productive capacity. And that detaches us then from these international and very disrupted markets.
Because the costs of, say, housing is arguably one of the big barriers which is stopping housing developers actually pressing forward. But there are also, as you said, many other barriers to delivery. I mean, having spent 9 months, I suppose, examining the sector from the government perspective, I mean, what would you say are the barriers that are most undermining the UK's ability to convert this ambition into reality?
Well, I think what I'd say is we are converting the ambition into reality. I mean, that's why, as I mentioned, we're seeing the housing numbers tick up. But a clear problem at the start were these issues around planning. So it was a bit of a slogan at the time of the general election, but I'm not entirely sure how popular a slogan it was. But it was about being on the side of the builders rather than the blockers. The Prime Minister's repeated it many times, actually, and he's really serious about it. We need to sort of build our way out of growing the economy. And it's not, when we talk about housing, like, it's not just houses. It is the valuable infrastructure around the community that makes those houses work.
You need the schools, you need all the bits.
So we're investing huge amounts in roads, in rail. Even like in my own constituency, we're building a new school where we've just had approval for a new school where where we've got a lot of development of housing, and this is happening across the whole country. So you've got to kind of put the two things together, I think, the housing target and the infrastructure spend.
Which brings me, of course, to the fact that your role spans Department for Business and Trade, and, of course, the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero. Big ambitions, of course, for nuclear, for wind, for solar power, all of which really underpin this housing target, because you need the power, and, of course, you need also the water supplies. Are we making fast enough progress on that? You mentioned the Planning Infrastructure Act. Is that transforming?
Well, I can talk about power and water as well, if you like. So you're right, I have the joy of being a split minister between two departments, business and energy.
You have many plates spinning.
Yeah, I do indeed. It means you get twice as many things to do, but I don't mind. I really enjoy it, actually. And on the energy side, from day one coming into government, our plan has been clear, and we call it our Clean Power 2030 mission. So, like, simple way to explain it to everybody is really we want to be sure that by 2030, about 95% of the power that we generate will be renewable energy. And there's a number of good reasons for that, but if you'll just indulge me, I'll highlight some of the ones that are important for the construction sector. The first and most important thing for the construction sector is it's the cheapest form of power available. Solar is our cheapest power. Onshore wind, we lifted the onshore wind ban straight away when we came into government. Onshore wind is the second cheapest. Offshore wind is the third cheapest. So if we can lock in as much of that as possible, then it means we can guarantee lower energy prices. And one thing that the Chancellor of the Exchequer and Ed Miliband, my boss in the Energy Department, announced recently was that we're going to move further and faster on delinking our energy price from gas, because at the moment we've got loads of renewables, but the price of electricity we pay is still high, and it's largely because it's actually, even though gas is a small amount, it sets the price. So there's a number of kind of technical reasons why it's hard to do that, but we are doing that. We're cracking on with that as well. So that means that we'll be able to, as a country, we'll get to a point by 2030 where we have a competitive advantage in electricity versus, say, our European neighbours and others. So that gives a great baseline. The second thing that does is it gives us stability. So when the oil price shoots up as a result of some action by Vladimir Putin or whatever, we'll be insulated from that to a great extent. But then clearly we need to move the economy across to a position where it's using that electricity. So where we can detach people from carbon emitting sources of heat or power into green electricity, they'll have this benefit of stable, lower cost electricity. And of course, we're saving the planet at the same time. So what isn't there to feel good about if we're doing that? And then the final point is, all of this electricity investment is great economic activity because it's infrastructure, it's factory-made components, it's really good jobs up and down the country.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about those factory-made components because the new hospital program, for instance, is really looking towards industrialization, Hospital 2.0, the transformation of the delivery process through the use of data and modern methods. I mean, do you see this as a critical step, therefore, for delivering the strategy, changing the way that we build?
Well, I do. So I mentioned at the top of the programme that I'd spent a bit of time in the construction industry.
Tell me about that then.
Well, so I've spent all my career in the steel industry. So my link to construction, you might have thought, was simply just, providing materials and those difficult customers in the construction industry demanding our materials are ever cheaper and ever better and so on, which is fine, helps us be better steelmakers. But I actually spent a bit of time working in a business using modern methods of construction to produce essentially modular buildings. We called them modular because the word prefabricated wasn't particularly liked in the market at the time.
No.
And I don't think it still is. It still isn't. But I kind of like it because it is what it is. So, I don't mind that at all. And of course, we were looking at that from a steel perspective. And one of the biggest problems we had was it was more efficient. It helped reduce the cost, particularly for public works. Or large-scale building projects, but there was a low level of market acceptance. Some of that was to do with trades. You've got to have you need a different skill set if you're going to use prefabricated components. But ultimately, there wasn't that market acceptance. Now let's fast forward 20 odd years, which is probably like how long ago it was that I worked on that. And I walked into my first meeting as co-chair of the Construction Leadership Council and told them I'm very interested in modern methods of construction. I don't know if that was the first time that had happened, but I tell you, the response I got was really good. The sector's interested in it as well.
But it's interesting, but it's also been quite severely burnt in the past in terms of investing and not having a pipeline, which is, I suppose, what an idea like the Hospital 2.0 does do. It brings that pipeline so that people can invest with confidence.
It does. And that's the point I was making earlier about certainty.
Yeah.
So just as we've got the home building target that provides the industry with some certainty that it can invest, we've got the infrastructure plan as well. You're right, it's the same on hospitals too. But then another bit of technology that I think is worth mentioning is, of course, I'm talking about like pretty hard things like the materials and the sort of sub-assemblies and components and so on. But on the design and building management side as well, the development of IT infrastructure and the application of artificial intelligence in that space, I think it can do two things. So, like, ultimately, it can reduce the embedded costs and running costs of a building and so on, transform the design of a building and accelerate that design process. But if we're looking at something like hospitals, there is the opportunity to introduce standardization and repeatability. And this is where I think if you have a combination of both the advanced information technology tools and modern methods of construction together, then that's something that surely could help us to drive down the cost of construction. And this isn't a new thing. There was a construction revolution in the Victorian era that was based around standardized components. At that time, it was cast iron and encaustic tiles. Now we can create a similar industrial revolution in buildings as well.
I'm involved with the building centre in Store Street, and of course, that was the home of catalogues. You went there and you chose your standardised product. Do you think that the current pipeline can be delivered without this kind of transformation then?
Well, I think there's a couple of difficulties in continuing to do things the way that we are. I mean, the industry recognises that we've got a problem with skills.
Yeah.
And government's helping with that. We've setting up 10 construction skills academies. I'm very clear about how good these jobs are, but the scale of ambition is incredibly high. And so we have to think about how will we have enough sort of brickies and chippies, etc. around to be able to help with that. So there is a constraint on skills, but there's also a constraint on capital as well, and that's not something that we have particularly discussed. But again, an impact of the war in the Middle East is that interest rates have gone up, and so there's two ways to look at that. Either that means we do fewer projects, or it means that we find more efficient ways to deliver the projects we have.
But the constraint on capital really is linked to confidence, as you said before, because there are people who want to invest in businesses, funds that want to invest in infrastructure projects, provided they know how that pipeline is looking.
Yes, so that's true. And I think that we have to recognise as well, when it comes to infrastructure investment, we're in an internationally competitive market.
Yeah.
So, the sort of patient capital that we have seen invest in our infrastructure in the UK over many decades has largely come from overseas pension funds. And I don't know how well it was observed, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer in her Mansion House of Courts, again, not long after the last general election, gave some really good guidance towards the pensions industry in the UK about the opportunity to invest in infrastructure in the UK as well. And so I think that, whilst there is the opportunity to increase that flow of capital, we have to recognise whether it's UK capital or overseas capital, we're in a competition for it. And that, whilst that capital is patient, if the UK has a reputation of not delivering projects on time and on budget, then we will be higher up the risk register.
Well, as it was pointed out recently to me, PPPs, not one of those P's is philanthropy. So, people need to make a profit out of this investment. You mentioned skills. Government has committed to invest an extra £625 million in construction skills through the Construction Skills Mission Board, which is driving the delivery of that. How do you see that panning out? What kind of skills do you anticipate the construction industry bringing in?
Well, it's quite a range of skills, of course. I mean, certainly for people who are associated with the industry. I mean, I think what probably everybody thinks about when we talk about construction skills are the classic trades.
Yeah.
I mentioned some of them earlier, and of course, regardless of the methods of construction that we deploy, then those trades are all still needed. I mean, ultimately, there is particularly if you look at housing, the UK market is quite conservative in terms of what consumers want. Even if we deploy new materials or modular construction methods, so those trades are there. But there is a wider range of skills as well in construction. If I think about things, we mentioned information technology, but you also think about skills like project management and so on as well.
But also
quantity surveying, etc.
But also on the back of modern methods of construction, factory delivery, etc.
No, you're absolutely right. This morning I was at the conference of Logistics UK, and you can't have factory-built components without a strong logistical supply chain to back it up as well.
Well, CITB would suggest that we need 293,000 workers by 2029, yet the government target is 60,000. Is there a risk that our ambitions will be held back by perhaps the refusal to expand the shortage occupation list, perhaps?
Well, look, I think one thing that the general public has been quite clear about, and it's clearly a very important political area at the moment, is they want to see investment in opportunities for young people or people who are retraining in this country well ahead of any discussion around immigration. And you might have seen this week, and I was frankly quite shocked to read the report from the former Member of Parliament from Darlington, Alan Milburn, about the desperate need of young people in this country who are not in employment, education or training. And I know, and you know, and your listeners know, what a great career these people could have.
And a varied career
if they were in the construction sector. And I'm not just talking about the opportunity to earn a steady wage, because you can, but that sense of self-satisfaction at the end of the day of a job well done. Or, when you've completed a project and every time you drive down that road for the next 20 years, that's the thing that you built.
Yeah.
There aren't other professions that can provide you with that level of lifelong job satisfaction. So we have a duty, all of us who are involved in the construction sector, to think, how can we best support our young people to get access to those jobs before we're thinking about, well, maybe we would make those jobs available to people from overseas.
Not least because the workforce is ageing. I think 35% of the construction sector workforce is over 50. Do we need to have more incentives, government-backed incentives, perhaps, to make sure that those NEETs are given opportunities?
Well, I think some of the issues are structural, and they go back a really long time, actually. I mean, if you think about some of those people, some of those, if your listeners will forgive me, some of those slightly older blokes, they're only a bit older than me, actually, who work in the construction industry. And like me, they probably had a similar sort of career route to me. They probably left school, went straight into industry, and then got the support of some organisation to develop the skills that they needed. And actually, at that time, a lot of that support would have come from local authorities who had big local authority house building programmes, which we pretty much stopped. There's not much of that happening now in the UK. And so the cost of training then falls on small businesses. And as someone who's run a small business, I know how hard that is. If you invest in an apprentice, that's a big thing to do in terms of time, never mind money. But I've seen a really good example of how that works. I visited construction college in East London really quite recently. And what they've done is they've set up a process where each of their students at the construction college is associated with a small business in the local area, and they seem to have like a really kind of active engagement with these small businesses. I've met some of the small business owners, and what that does really is it helps to build that relationship and de-risk the whole process for the small business as well, but also provides opportunities for young people that wouldn't otherwise be there. I think somehow we need to grow schemes like that around the country so that our either self-employed or small business owners in the construction industry feel like that they've got the confidence in their business plan and their time to be able to make those spaces for young people. So that creates the pull, we've got the market pull to go forward for creating more apprenticeships and so on as well.
Well, I know your time is very, very pressing, but so just to wrap things up, there's a lot to do in terms of delivering the government's construction infrastructure ambitions. You've set out, there's some really clear things that the government is putting in place. Is the supply chain moving fast enough or transforming fast enough for you?
I think this is a really great question, actually, because supply chains is a lot of people just look at the sort of end company, but supply chain is exactly the area that I'm starting to dig into now. Right. So when I came
on their case, then.
Yeah, well, I am. So when I came into this role, like my number one objective was actually around health and safety, and I really wanted to make sure that we sort of got that in the right place with the sector. And I'm really pleased with the engagement that I've had on that. Clearly, we've done a lot of work on skills, and as I mentioned, the planning reform and getting the market demand in the right place. But it really worries me that we could do all of that, and then ultimately that supply chain value could be overseas, not just in construction, by the way, but in a lot of these other industrial sectors. And so one specific area where we're doing some work on this right now is around the nuclear industry, where we've got such an opportunity with our nuclear investment, both in big power stations, but actually small modular reactors as well, and working with the end company, in this case, for small modular reactors, our national champion is Rolls-Royce, but clearly on any big government project, how do we get that supply chain to be embedded in the UK? And I can tell you that is a really live issue across government. The Cabinet Minister, Chris Ward, published some new procurement guidelines for some sectors around that. I've had discussions with my colleagues at the most senior levels of government about this, and we are pushing hard on ensuring that we maximise that supply chain procurement potential in the UK.
Because that's about doing more than just building a nuclear reactor or a series of small modular reactors. It's actually creating an industry that sits behind it, which can be exported.
It absolutely is, and this is the fundamental difference, I think, between this government and previous governments. Which is that we care where every pound of taxpayers' money is spent. Mm-hmm. So we're not in the business of buying an offshore wind tower. Boris Johnson used to say the UK is the world's biggest market for offshore wind, and it is. But that doesn't help us in the UK if we just buy those wind towers from someone else and plonk them in the North Sea. So we've been really clear when we're doing this, our mission is to create jobs and industries here, to build our infrastructure, and then, as you said, we can export that around the world.
So what surprised you in the job so far?
I'll tell you what surprised me. What surprised me is like how much I have really enjoyed getting stuck into some of the construction stuff. So you mentioned my colleague Mike Reader earlier, who's worked his whole life in the construction industry, and he's been a great support to me in Parliament as well. And he said to me, "Chris, you are absolutely going to love this because the construction industry is such a great industry to work in," and he's been 100% right. But it also goes back to that point I made about really that sort of sense of self-worth and feeling that you've done something. I've spent my whole life making steel. Like, you can get quite a lot of enjoyment out of that as well, I have to say. But in this role, I know I can contribute in a way that we will get infrastructure in the ground, in the country, that will be there long after my time on this earth is finished. And that, to me, certainly gives me some sense of satisfaction, not to mention the great jobs that we're providing for young people too.
So finally, has anything particularly delighted you when you've been going around the country looking at these projects?
Well, there's nothing I like more when I'm visiting places is to have a go myself. So I'm a pretty practical sort of guy. And so I always, and also it's really useful for me because I have loads of DIY projects at home and I'm learning some good skills now. So there's nothing I like more than to get stuck in. And particularly, when I visited like apprentices and so on, getting them to teach me stuff is just great. I really love it because there's nothing better than seeing like a young apprentice show off their skills by demonstrating what they do, and then like having a laugh at me when I completely mangle whatever it is that I'm trying to do as well. So whether it's like pipe bending or tiling or bricklaying, the thing that I really like is getting hands-on, doing something practical, and engaging with the young people who are working in the sector.
Well, Chris, huge opportunities ahead for the construction sector. I suppose I have to ask you before, what's your current DIY project?
Oh, great. Well, I've just completed one. So I've just finished a hedgehog box, which the hedgehog has gone nowhere near and has decided to camp in my pampas grass instead. So that's a shame. And I am just starting on a project. I've got but it's not quite as fun. It's a big painting and decorating project at home as well. But I've been observing some good techniques for that, and I'm hoping to deploy them to the satisfaction of everyone concerned in my family. Well, so so I've got a customer. So we'll see how well I do with that.
No. I imagine you've got a customer who's very, very on the case in terms of quality.
That's exactly what I've got.
Anyway, huge opportunities ahead for the construction sector around the country as well as in your home, clearly. Yeah. But as we discussed, there are many challenges to overcome. So thanks so much for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast today to update us on the government's ambitions and how you see it all panning out. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right.
Well, Chris, sadly, that's all we've got time for on the podcast now, but there is more in the pipeline as we continue to probe the big issues facing the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to the Minister, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.